Good morning. Today we continue with our OAC holiday season celebrations and move on to Proposal 2023-11. As I noted yesterday, keep in mind that the process for voting on Proposal 11 is potentially impacted by Resolution 2. So make sure you go back and understand Resolution 2 before moving on. If Resolution 2 is adopted, when we get to Proposals 10 and 11 on the convention floor, we will first talk about them in comparison to one another. We'll then take a vote on Proposal 10 versus Proposal 11. Whichever of those two comes out on top of that first vote will be the first of the two voted on in comparison to the current legislation. If that first proposal is adopted, we will not vote on the other. If the first proposal is not adopted, we will then move on to the other proposal in comparison to the current legislation. Proposal 11 is sponsored by the Division III Management Council and similar to Proposal 10 would amend the playing and practice seasons legislation to eliminate the current weeks model. Unlike Proposal 10, Proposal 11 would retain many of the current playing season parameters, so the bulk of each team's practice sessions still occur between the first permissible practice date and the last date of competition. Before I get started, I want to note that football is not at all impacted by this proposal. So when we talk about fall sports, we're talking about fall sports other than football. Okay, so all other fall sports under this proposal would be permitted to start practice on a date 16 units before the first permissible contest date. Once fall sports start their season, they would not have to count days at all until the NCAA championship selection date in their respective sport. They would obviously still be required to take one day off per week, but they would not have to otherwise worry about counting anything during that traditional segment. They could then begin non-traditional segment practice on the first day of classes after January 1st and can actually continue non-traditional segment practice until 5 weekdays before the spring final exam period. During that time designated for non-traditional segment practice, fall sports would be permitted 24 days of athletically related activity, including one date of competition. So that's a bit of an expansion on the current non-traditional segment model. Under Proposal 11, winter sports would be permitted 114 days of practice. So technically, winter sports would retain their existing practice start dates, but they could use up to 8 days of practice before their currently permitted practice start date or after the conclusion of their regular season. Winter sports would still not be permitted to compete outside of their standard regular season. And then spring sports would be permitted to start their non-traditional segment on September 7th or the first day of classes. And similar to fall sports, they'd be permitted 24 non-traditional segment days. They could use up to 12 of those 24 days in the 2 weeks leading directly into the traditional segment practice season. Their traditional segment would then begin 15 weeks before the NCAA championship selection in their respective sport. And between the traditional segment start date and the NCAA championship selection date in that sport, spring sports would not need to count days at all. They simply need to abide by the 1 day off per week legislation. And then the last thing to note is under Proposal 11, golf, rowing, and tennis would be permitted 114 days and would essentially retain their existing start and end dates to the fall and spring season. So as I said yesterday, as you think about voting on this one, you first want to think about comparing Proposals 10 and 11 to one another and determine which of the two playing season models you prefer. You'll then want to consider each of those two proposals in comparison to the existing playing and practice seasons legislation.